Today is Sunday, April 5th, 2026, and today is National Deep Dish Pizza Day, which feels less like pizza and more like a structural commitment. At some point, someone looked at a regular slice and thought, what if this required planning? Welcome to This Day in History from, wait, that's random. I'm your host, C.L. Burns. On this date in 1792, George Washington issued the first presidential veto in United States history. The bill in question dealt with how congressional districts were being drawn, specifically how representation in the House would be divided among the states. At first glance, it might seem like a technical issue, but it wasn't. It was about fairness. How do you decide how many representatives each state gets? And more importantly, how do you make sure the system isn't being manipulated? The Constitution gave the president the power to veto legislation, but up to that moment, it actually hadn't been used yet. So the question wasn't whether the bill was right or wrong. It was whether the president should step in at all. Washington reviewed the bill and determined that it didn't follow the constitutional guidelines for representation. And then he did something that, at the time, set a tone for everything that followed. He rejected it. The mechanism here is straightforward. A veto allows the president to send a bill back to Congress instead of signing it into law. But what makes this moment significant is how carefully it was handled. Washington didn't use the veto for political disagreement. He used it because he believed the bill was unconstitutional. And that set an early expectation. The veto wasn't just a tool of power, it was a check. A way to pause the system and say, something here doesn't align. And once that tool exists in practice, it became part of how the system functioned going forward. Sometimes systems are shaped by decisions at the highest levels, and sometimes they're reshaped quietly, one person at a time. Today in 1887, Anne Sullivan arrived at the home of Helen Keller, beginning a teaching relationship that would become one of the most well-known educational stories in history. Helen Keller had lost both her sight and hearing at a very young age due to illness. Without these two senses, communication was extremely limited. Imagine trying to understand the world without being able to hear or see, and without a structured way to connect words to meanings. That's where Anne Sullivan came in. Her approach wasn't based on lectures or visual instruction, it was tactile. She would spell words into Helen's hand using a manual alphabet, while simultaneously placing objects in her other hand. For example, she would spell water while letting water run over her hand. At first, it didn't click. There was no immediate connection between the letters and the objects. But then there was a moment. At the water pump, something shifted. Helen Keller realized that the patterns being traced in her hand represented things, that words had meaning. That realization changed everything. The mechanism here is about association, linking physical sensation to symbolic language. Once that connection was made, learning accelerated rapidly. And what started as isolation became communication. It's one of those moments where the change isn't visible from the outside, but internally everything is different. And sometimes the systems people live in don't just affect individuals. Sometimes they shape global tension. On this date in 1951, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were sentenced to death for passing atomic secrets to the Soviet Union. This happened during the early years of the Cold War, a period defined by political tension, ideological conflict, and an intense race for technological and military advantage. At the center of this case was one of the most significant developments of the 20th century: nuclear weapons. The United States had developed the atomic bomb during World War II. Maintaining that advantage was seen as critical. So when evidence emerged that classified information might have been shared with the Soviet Union, the stakes were extremely high. The Rosenbergs were accused of participating in a network that passed information about nuclear weapons design. Their trial became one of the most closely watched cases of the time. But it was also controversial. Some believed the evidence justified the conviction. Others questioned whether the punishment fit the crime, or whether fears and politics played too large a role. And part of what made this moment so intense was that the concern wasn't entirely imagined. There were real cases of espionage. Declassified records later confirmed that Soviet intelligence had sources inside the United States, including individuals connected with the government, media, education, and other institutions. But at the time, suspicion spread far beyond what could be clearly proven. Investigations expanded, accusations increased, and fear began to move faster than clarity. Because once a country believes its security may be compromised, the response doesn't always stay narrowly focused. And that's where things became complicated, because it becomes difficult to separate what is known from what is suspected. The mechanism here is espionage, a transfer of information, often secretly, from one nation to another. But in this case, it wasn't just about information. It was about trust, fear, and how a country reacts when it believes something critical may have been exposed. And while some moments are defined by fear and uncertainty, others are defined by what people chose to build in response to the world around them. Booker T. Washington was born on April 5, 1856. He became an influential educator, author, and a leader during a time when the United States was still defining what freedom and opportunity meant after the Civil War. Washington believed strongly in education as a path forward. He founded the Tuskegee Institute, where students were taught practical skills alongside academic subjects. His approach focused on building stability and independence through learning and work. At the time, his views sparked debate. Some believed his approach was too gradual. Others saw it as a practical way to create progress within the constraints of time. But regardless of perspective, his impact was significant. He helped establish institutions that would expand access to education and opportunity for thousands of people. And that kind of work tends to last. If you step back and look at these moments together, something starts to emerge. A president defines how power should be used. A teacher opens a path to communication where there wasn't one before. And a nation confronts uncertainty during a time of global tension. Different situations, different scales. But each one is about how people respond when the system they're part of is tested. Anyway, those are a few of the things I ended up discovering while wandering through April 5th. Stop by tomorrow and we'll see what the next day decides to hand us. If you want to know more about me or the work I do, you can find everything at waitthat'srandom.com. I'm C.L. Burns, and I appreciate you stopping by.